Which Linux distro is for you? This is going to be your ultimate guide to choosing a Linux distribution. I'm formatting this a little bit differently compared to a lot of other videos you may see trying to help you pick a Linux distro. So what I'm going to be doing is giving just a simple overview of all of the most notable Linux distributions and basically describing their goals as a project. And then I'm going to be putting it in a tier list based on how well it achieves the goals it's trying to achieve, if there's a good product market fit. And that way you can sort of go on a Linux distribution based on what your goal of using Linux is going to be, but also with consideration of how well it actually achieves that goal that both you would have as a user and they have as a distro, if that makes sense. So we're going to start off with Debian Linux. Their tagline is the universal OS. And so you're going to get very stable packages that may be a little bit older, but they're all very heavily tested. You're not going to be having random system changes happen on you. They take a very conservative approach to what they ship. And it's because of this that Debian has become a very, very popular base platform for a lot of different projects, including Ubuntu, and then you have all the Ubuntu-based distros and several other Debian spins. However, this isn't the most new user-friendly. There are going to be places where you're going to need to use the terminal, but it's just a very stable package base that you can kind of form into what you want, but with stable packages. And it's for that reason I'm going to have to give Debian an S tier. Now, next up, we have Ubuntu. Now, for a long time, Ubuntu was the de facto distro you should use if you were getting started on Linux, but that started changing around maybe 2018-ish. The thing about Ubuntu is Canonical is very bad at listening to community feedback. Sometimes it feels like they just essentially ignore community feedback. For example, they're building a package management system called Snap, which is their supposed to be universal package manager, although in practice it really only works well on Ubuntu. And the Snap store isn't that well curated. There's a lot of apps that have older versions. There's a lot of apps that are just low quality crapware. And then they're also just doing a lot of experimental things that don't really benefit their target audience, which seems to be just a stable desktop OS. But they're doing experimental things like shipping out sudo rs, which that is cool technology, but I don't think Ubuntu should be the first distro adopting it. And so the Ubuntu platform on a desktop has just really been going downhill, and it's been affecting a lot of different distributions based on Ubuntu. However, Ubuntu for the longest time was the biggest Linux distro by far. It still probably is. And so you're going to get a very wide community of people running Ubuntu to get guides, documentation, and help from. And so if this was 2018, I would probably put Ubuntu to be S tier, but right now I'm gonna have to put Ubuntu desktop as B tier. And by the way, for this tier list, I'm not including desktop environment variants. So if you want to use something other than the GNOME desktop, they have several respins like Kubuntu, Xubuntu, Ubuntu Budgie, Ubuntu Cinnamon, things like that. So I'm including that in the consideration of ranking all of these distros. That said, let's talk about Ubuntu Server, because Ubuntu is still a very, very good server experience. I'd argue probably the best server experience for a home server. Even with the Snap stuff, you can just snap install Nextcloud, for example, and you're going to be getting a very easy installation with no extra steps, no editing config files and setting up Apache. It's just a very good experience to use. So for a home server, I'm going to put Ubuntu, let's do S tier. Next up, we have Linux Mint. This is a distro based on Ubuntu LTS, so you're going to get a pretty stable base, and they also developed the Cinnamon desktop. And another good thing about Linux Mint is when Ubuntu that they're based on makes a decision that the community disagrees with, Linux Mint does whatever it can to reverse it or eliminate the damage. For example, if you try and install the Chromium package on Ubuntu, it ends up installing a Snap package, and so Linux Mint doesn't let the package manager install Snap like that, and instead they end up using Mozilla's own repos for projects like Firefox, which is one of the packages that does that. And Linux Mint is one of the best distros at listening to their community. And so for inventing the Cinnamon desktop and just being very in touch with their user base, I have to give Linux Mint an S tier. Next up, we have Zorin OS. This is another Ubuntu-based operating system, and this is known for having a very beautiful looking interface that also looks and functions a lot like Windows, so it's very beginner friendly. They even have a layout switcher of different layouts you can have. But they also have a Zorin OS Pro, which is a good way to support the project, but A lot of people think that they have to buy it and don't treat it like a way of supporting the project, and all the Pro version really does is just repackage a bunch of extra open source software. And so I actually think the Pro version is worse than the free version because it's just a more bloated operating system. The Pro version also has extra layouts too, but you can also kind of replicate these layouts yourself using GNOME, which means I don't think it's justified paying to get extra layouts for the Pro version. Its releases are really slow. It usually takes a good 6 months for Zorin OS to get an update on a new Ubuntu LTS base, and it suffers all the same problems that stock Ubuntu does. So I do think it's a better option right now than the regular Ubuntu desktop for a lot of new users, but I don't think it's S tier. I'm gonna put in A tier. Next up, we have Pop! OS. Now, if this were 2021, I would put Pop! OS at S tier. It's basically Ubuntu, but sort of like Linux Mint, they're a lot better at listening to their community. So you're not going to get any of the weird snap stuff you get with Ubuntu. And driver support is very easy. It's just a very, very easy to use desktop. They're also making their own desktop environment called Cosmic, and it's looking out to be a very cool project. And so I would have put it at S tier, but the thing is that the Cosmic desktop right now is so new that there's just a lot of issues people have been encountering, and this is going to get better. I could easily see Pop! OS going back to S tier in the future, but just for the time being, you're basically running a beta of Cosmic, and they market it as a LTS distro without telling you that Cosmic is very new and that you might have to expect issues. So because of that, I'm gonna have to give it a B tier, but this could easily go back up to S tier in the future. Next up, we have Elementary OS. So this is another Ubuntu-based distro that has its own desktop environment, and it has its own design language with its own library for building apps called libgranite. And for a long time, they had a whole ecosystem of community-developed apps that fit perfectly into what Elementary OS is trying to do. However, GNOME saw that idea, and they made libadwaita, which essentially does the same thing that Elementary OS was trying to do. And GNOME is a way bigger project, so it's getting way more contributors, and there's now a lot more libadwaita GNOME apps, and they're also just very opinionated in what they ship, and they make a lot of controversial design decisions. So I would have given this A tier in the past, but now with libadwaita, I feel like GNOME kind of executes the Elementary OS vision that they originally had back when Elementary OS was first created. GNOME actually executes that better than Elementary does now, which means I'm gonna have to give Elementary OS a C tier, especially because they're also behind on technology like the Wayland transition. Next up, we have Arch Linux. So this is not a beginner-friendly distro at all. You're basically getting a package platform of very bleeding-edge packages, and you're getting the latest version of everything. It's a rolling release. However, you have to build it yourself from the ground up. So if you want a lot of control over your operating system, this is one of the best options. And if you want to really learn how Linux works, this is also one of the best options. It has probably the best official documentation of any Linux distro with the Arch wiki. And if we're going back to looking at these types of distributions as a platform, a lot of distros build on the Arch platform because they're able to ship such new packages that are bleeding edge. But like I said, it's not beginner friendly. You have to do the installation through the terminal and build it out yourself. Sometimes you're going to have updates that require manual intervention where you're going to have to change something to fix it. But I'm still going to give Arch Linux an S tier because it's just a very good platform for building out your own thing, and it's a very good way to learn how to use Linux. Now, next up, we have Manjaro. This is based on Arch, but it holds back packages to try and give these packages a little bit more testing and make them a little more stable. However, I'm going to eventually make a video on why I'm not a fan of Manjaro, but they've had some weird controversies in the past with their management. They've done things like pre-install proprietary Office suites out of the box. Another thing is because they hold back packages, sometimes if you install an AUR package, it ends up nuking your Manjaro installation. And this is a huge problem because a lot of people install Manjaro because they want an easy Arch-based distro for the AUR. And I think a lot of people running Manjaro should either be just using regular Arch or be using just a more stable package platform base. And for that reason, I'm going to have to give Manjaro a C tier. Next up, we have Endeavor OS. Now, this is another Arch-based distribution, and it's supposed to be just an easy installation for Arch, and it has a lot of tools to sort of configure Arch and do things like that. This is still not a new user-friendly Linux distribution because you're still dealing with the fast-moving nature of Arch and may have to fix broken packages and things. However, in my opinion, if you've installed Arch and you've learned how Arch works and you're a seasoned Arch user, but you have a new device and you just want to get an Arch system up and going, I think EndeavourOS is the perfect distribution for that. It's just a very easy way to get a Arch distro on your system. There's friendly tools for managing it. But that said, you're still going to have to learn Arch Linux if you are picking this distribution. For that, I'm going to give it an A tier. Next up, we have KaOS, but this is similar to EndeavourOS, where you're getting a very easy Arch installation. However, they also ship super optimized packages that are going to have performance benefits and things like that, as well as, again, tools to just manage some of the things that you need to manage on Arch type systems. Again, if you're running any Arch-based distribution, you should be learning how Arch works before you install it, but I still think it's a very good option for power users, especially if you need extra performance out of your computer if you're doing something like gaming, so I'm putting it at A tier. Next up, we have Garuda Linux. This is the last Arch-based distro I'm showing off for now, but this is a gaming-focused Arch-based distribution with a bunch of tools pre-installed to help manage your Arch install. But another thing about it is a lot of the desktop options that they ship are just very beautiful looking. So if you want a really aesthetic looking system and you want some gaming features and benefits and extra tools, Garuda's a great option to look at. So I'm going to be giving Garuda an A tier. Next up, we have Fedora Linux. So this is another fixed release distro where they have a new release every 6 months. However, the new release is going to have very new packages, such as the latest version of GNOME and new technology such as Pipewire, things like that. They're usually the first distribution to ship a lot of different new technology that ends up becoming standardized across Linux in the future. Sometimes they can be a little bit too quick to jump the gun with some sort of new technologies. Like back in the day, they were the first distro to adopt Wayland and it just wasn't ready yet and things were breaking. However, even if new packages, Fedora is just very readily tested, so it's going to be a very, very stable OS. And I don't think it's fully beginner friendly because you do have to install some third-party repos for drivers, and they do ship a lot of bleeding edge tech, but it is one of my favorite Linux distributions, easy S tier. Next up, we have Nobara. This is a Fedora-based distribution that has a bunch of enhancements for gaming, and it's supposed to be just a more beginner-friendly Fedora too. So you're going to be getting patches and things for gaming. They're less conservative with things like proprietary packages, things like that. However, there are some parts of the operating system that just don't have the same sort of polish that a lot of these other distributions have. Also, fun fact, I used to make a Linux distro called RHEL, and they use the welcome screen from RHEL in Nobara, so but I'm not going to be biased. I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to give Nobara an A tier. Damn, I don't know what happened to the screenshots here, but the next distribution is KaOS. This used to be Nobara, but instead of Fedora base, I think it used to be an Ubuntu base. Yep, I do remember that correctly, but they ended up switching it to be a Debian base instead. But now it has sort of become a little bit more of a distribution independent from Nobara, so there's going to be some other bonuses, like they support more desktops than Nobara. So it has sort of turned into its own thing other than just Ubuntu-based Nobara. So I'm going to give KaOS a tier. Now, next up, we have Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, this is not something that most people would want to run on a desktop operating system. This is the de facto Linux distribution for any heavy production enterprise usage. So you're going to be buying a license from Red Hat, but you're going to be getting support on the distribution from Red Hat. It's also a very narrow base of packages that they support because every package shipped in Red Hat has to end up getting support from the company. So they only ship things that they know are going to work. There's not that many extra packages you can install on Red Hat unless you get the EPEL repos, which is made by the Fedora team and adds extra packages for Red Hat. And speaking of Fedora, what they do is they take a Fedora release, like I think Red Hat 10 is based on Fedora 40 if I remember correctly, and then there is another distro called CentOS Stream that's in the middle between them that I'm going to talk about later. But essentially they take a Fedora build and they turn it into a long-term support release that ends up being fully enterprise ready with all of the compliance things taken care of, all of that. So I think if you're running a production or an enterprise system, I think Red Hat Enterprise Linux is just obviously the best option for most of those types of systems. Next up, we have Alma Linux. So this is a community rebuild of Red Hat Linux. Now, this isn't an exact one-to-one clone. They actually have some extra things that they add to the distro, such as just extra platform support, things like that. But it is going to be binary compatible. So anything that can run on Red Hat is going to be able to run on Alma Linux. This is, in my opinion, the best Red Hat Linux clone that you can get. It's what I'm using to build my distro, SteamOS, as a base. Just a very stable and reliable set of software. You aren't going to get full enterprise support, but this is just the community supported version of that. So I'm going to give Alma Linux an S tier. Oh, and Red Hat Linux an S tier. I forgot to rank that. Next up, we have Rocky Linux. This is another Red Hat clone, and it's also supposed to be a community maintained clone. This one tries harder than Alma does to be an exact rebuild of Red Hat. They advertise it as bug for bug compatible, which means if you have a bug on Red Hat, you'll be able to reproduce it on Rocky. I personally prefer just having the extra bonuses Alma will give you, because you still have the binary compatibility, which is what most of the people needing a RHEL clone need. They don't need full bug for bug compatibility. There's very rare cases where you do. And then additionally, there are some weird management things involving Rocky Linux. For example, there's a company called CIQ, which is a for-profit company supporting Rocky Linux, and it's headed by the same guy who runs the Rocky Linux Foundation. And so there is some conflict of interest there compared to something like Alma Linux. That's a super oversimplification of the management issues that I see in Rocky Linux. I'm going to make a full video on that eventually, but I would still trust it as a good base distro, so I'm going to give it an A tier. Next up, we have Oracle Linux. Literally, this is another clone of Red Hat, but Oracle's the one providing support instead of Red Hat. That's basically the only difference. You're just paying support to a different company for a product that they didn't make. It's also worth noting that Red Hat is one of the biggest supporters of Linux development. A lot of new technology in the Linux space comes out of Red Hat, and Oracle has been known to do the opposite. They've been known to be very litigative and go after open source. And they do have a free version of Oracle Linux without enterprise support, but in that case, just use Alma or Rocky. And so literally, this is just Red Hat with cheaper support from a worse company. So I'm going to be giving this a D tier. I could have swore I had a slide for CentOS Stream, but I didn't. But that's the next distro. This is sort of a testing branch for Red Hat, kind of. So what I said earlier about Red Hat being based on Fedora, what actually happens is Fedora target release for a RHEL base ends up being what CentOS Stream's release is based on, and then it ends up tracking just ahead of Red Hat Linux. So if you want to contribute to Red Hat Linux, for example, you would just contribute to CentOS Stream, and then eventually it would just easily get pulled into Red Hat Linux. Because of that, it's not going to be as stable as Red Hat is. You're essentially getting whatever point release Red Hat is going to come out with just like a couple months earlier. It's not inherently an unstable distribution, but for a lot of people, I still wouldn't run it as a desktop for most people, because you probably don't want to run enterprise Linux as a desktop unless you're doing something crazy with it like I am with SteamOS. And then as a server option, you're just going to get something more stable from Red Hat, Alma Linux, and Rocky. But it does what it aims to do, and that is be a test branch for Red Hat. So I'm going to give it a B tier. Next up, we have Fedora Silverblue. So this takes Fedora and applies the bootc bootable container technology to the distro. So it turns it into a read-only file system, and you aren't able to use a package manager like you can on a traditional distro, and you end up having to use Flatpaks as all of your apps. But the entire operating system is distributed as one image, which means you're never going to have some sort of dependency conflict that ends up breaking your system. You install it and it just keeps updating, and it just works. It's kind of like having Fedora as a system, but with the Fedora project doing IT for you. So you get less control, but things are just going to work. That said, it does have a little bit of a learning curve because some of the environment is completely different from a normal Linux distribution, and you're going to have to learn ways to get around that. And there are other projects that actually take the same bootc technology that Fedora Silverblue ships and builds on top of Silverblue to make better projects. And so for that reason, I'm going to give Fedora Silverblue a tier. Now, speaking of Fedora Silverblue, let's talk about Universal Blue. This is an organization that takes bootc technology from Fedora Silverblue and uses it to make complete operating system experiences that just work. They have Bazite, which is the gaming one. It has a bunch of patches and tweaks to make gaming on Linux better. And then they have Aurora and Bluefin, and those are supposed to be just very stable container image-based KDE and GNOME platforms, and everything's supposed to just work. And so if you're considering running a Fedora Silverblue desktop, I would actually recommend one of the Universal Blue projects over Fedora Silverblue. Fedora Silverblue is the base and lays the groundwork for Universal Blue to create way better distro experiences that are just great. And so I'm giving all of the Universal Blue projects S tier. Next up, we have NixOS. So this one is a very advanced user distro. You basically have to learn a full programming language in order to use it. So you have this Nix configuration, and you basically configure every aspect of your system, what packages you want, what desktop you want, all of that, into this Nix config file, and then it generates a atomic image or snapshot that you can boot into of all of the things in your config file. And if something breaks, you can just go back to the last config file. And another thing is, if you have multiple devices and you want your setup to be identical across all of them, just port over the file of your NixOS config to each of your devices, and boom, they're all identical. Still though, like I said, you have to learn a full programming language. This distro is even harder to install and use than Arch. However, if you actually take the time and learn NixOS, it's one of the best operating systems you can run. So for that reason, I'm giving it an S tier. It achieves its goals exactly. Next up, we have openSUSE Tumbleweed. So this is a rolling release distribution. You're going to be getting pretty new packages. They aren't going to be 100% bleeding edge like Arch is. They're going to be a couple weeks behind sometimes, and they're more readily tested. And I think it's a very great package base, but as an operating system, sometimes openSUSE tends to have weird quirks. For example, one of the defining features of openSUSE is the YAST control center, essentially, where you can customize just about every aspect of your Linux system, basically any setting you can think of through this one control center. But a lot of the functionality is duplicated, which isn't that bad of an issue. That's the point of YAST, is to have every option available across environments, but sometimes these different tools conflict with each other. For example, YAST supports package installation and updating, and it has a full software manager in it for packages. But if you open KDE Discover or GNOME Software Center and turn on PackageKit, that breaks YAST, or if you turn on YAST, it'll break GNOME Software Center. Just things like that. There's just a lot of weird quirks around openSUSE, and for those reasons, it's also not the most beginner friendly, but it's still a pretty good base platform, so I'm going to give openSUSE Tumbleweed an A tier. Now next up is openSUSE Leap. So this is a more long-term support stable version of openSUSE. It's actually, in using it, a lot like using something like Red Hat, although if you want commercial support, you'd be getting SUSE Enterprise Linux instead, which is the same thing but with support. But it is like a Red Hat Alma Linux type distribution, so you probably only want to be using it in like enterprise environments, things like that. But for those environments, I think the Red Hat family of distributions just works a lot better. It's a lot more documented and widely supported. So I'm going to be giving openSUSE Leap a B tier. Next up, we have Bodhi Linux. So this is going to be another rolling release Linux distribution, and it's going to be a little bit more stable packages than something like Arch Linux. And it has its own package manager called XBPS, which is probably the fastest package manager on Linux. But they also make some interesting design decisions, such as using runit as its init system instead of systemd, which if you don't know what that means, then you probably should be using systemd and not runit. So this is a very fast and high performance distro, but its package base is also opinionated and somewhat small compared to something like Arch. And I think there's a lot of overlap between sort of the target type of person Void's trying to target with Arch Linux. And for most of those people, Arch Linux is going to be a better option. But if you want the very fast package manager and run it, it is still a pretty good option. I'm gonna give Void, I'm stuck between an A and a B. I'll go A tier. Next up, we have Solus, and this is a sad case of a project because this was my favorite Linux distribution in 2018. I would have put it at A tier if I was making this video in 2018. However, there's been a lot going on with the Solus project. It at one point got marked dormant on DistroWatch, and they had issues with the development team. There's just been a lot of weird management stuff going on. They did invent the Budgie desktop, which is one of the cleanest and nicest looking desktop environments, but now that is spun off into a separate project and is no longer maintained by the Solus team specifically. It's supposed to be a new user-friendly distro, but the problem with it is its repository just isn't very big. There's too many management things going on for it to be really good for a new user. When it first came out, it was one of the most stable rolling release Linux distributions I've ever used, but then I've also since then had package breakages on my own Solus system. So this would have been S tier in 2018, but right now I'm gonna have to give it D tier. They are working on a lot of cool stuff, but the thing about Solus is they always market all this cool stuff they're working on, and then it just never comes out. So I've been hyped and then disappointed by Solus for years now. Now, next up, we're going to be talking about some distros for very specific niche use cases. The first one's going to be Tails. So this is a distribution that's going to help you be anonymous. It helps you connect to Tor browser and things like that. Very good for privacy. It's a very good option if you're like an activist or something like that. I'm going to give this an S tier because it does exactly what it aims to achieve. And then we also have Cubes. So this is another security oriented distro, and it's loved even by Edward Snowden. And what this does is it essentially is a hypervisor for other operating systems, and then you run software inside virtual machines. So pretty much all the apps you're going to run through this are in their own virtual machine, which means that you do need a very beefy computer to actually run this distribution. However, if there's some sort of exploit with the application or something like that, like a 0-day, it doesn't actually escalate to your full system. It only can control the virtual machine. And so if you're for some reason in a situation where you need the maximum amount of security, this is the distribution for you. Like I said, it's used by Edward Snowden. If I were president of the United States and I had all these foreign actors trying to get into my system, this is the distribution I would use. So I'm giving that an S tier too. Next up, we have KDE Linux. So this is a distribution made for pen testing, which if you don't know what that is, it's supposed to be ethical hacking. The problem is you can kind of configure any Linux distribution to be good for pen testing. It's kind of just a distribution that just has things ready to go, but not anything that you can't do on a normal distro that I know of. And if you're into pen testing and security testing, you should be able to have the experience to do those things. And so I'm going to give KDE Linux a B tier. And then we also have Parrot OS, which is a very similar project, but Parrot OS is a little bit more minimal and it's a little bit more beginner friendly. So I'm also going to give Parrot OS a B tier. Next up, we have Gentoo Linux. This is what you would use if you want complete control over your Linux system. You end up having to compile everything from source, which means it takes forever to install anything, even the distribution itself. But you do have full options over things like compiler flags and things like that. So if you want to build out a system that has a bunch of performance flags and things like that, Gentoo is for you. But the overwhelming majority of people should never touch Gentoo. For that reason, I'm giving it a C tier. Next up, we have Slackware. This is the oldest currently surviving Linux distribution. People love it because it's known to be probably the most stable Linux distribution there is, because they are the most conservative with their package base of any Linux distribution. However, it's also not beginner friendly at all. It's pretty difficult to install. And if you don't need that much stability, there isn't that many good reasons to use Slackware. So for that reason, I'm gonna give it a B tier. Next up, we have Raspberry Pi OS. So this is a distribution made specifically for the Raspberry Pi, and it's very lightweight, very easy to use, based on Debian, so it's going to be stable. Easy, S tier for me. Next up, we have MX Linux. So this is based on Debian, and it's going to give you a weird XFCE layout, but it's going to be a very light distro. I think this is probably one of the best distros for old computers, but I'm not gonna lie, it's just not that special. So I'm gonna give it an A tier. There isn't really any problems with it, but it's just a really boring, stable, light distribution. Next up, we have Peppermint OS. Now, this is another one that I would have rated way higher back in the day. This used to be Ubuntu, but with a hybrid between LXDE and XFCE, which means it felt like you're using XFCE, but it was actually a lot lighter. And another thing Peppermint OS is known for is it was the first Linux distro to really be pushing web apps. They had their ICE SSB manager, which, fun fact, for a while I was the biggest contributor to the ICE SSB manager. But nowadays, Linux Mint does web apps better. I'm personally working on new web app tech for SteamOS and things like that. And damn, this is actually a pretty old screenshot, because the modern versions of Peppermint OS are actually based on Debian, and they remade a lot of their tools using the TK graphical user interface framework, which is not very good at integrating into the system. So the tools are kind of ugly. It just lost a lot of the polish that it really used to have. And they got rid of the LXDE XFCE hybrid to just XFCE now, which isn't that big of a deal, but it was something cool Peppermint used to have. It's still a very stable Debian-based distribution. You're not going to have any problems with it, but it just has lost a lot of what made like 2018 Peppermint OS special. So I'm gonna give it, this is one that's between a C and a B. I think it's high C tier. Next up, we have TinyCore Linux and Puppy Linux, and these are ultra lightweight distributions that you're going to want to put on very old hardware. So Puppy Linux is a little bit more full featured than TinyCore. TinyCore is only like a 28 megabyte download, so you can run that on pretty much anything. Puppy isn't as light as TinyCore, but it's just a better user experience. So if your hardware can run it, go for Puppy. But if you have really weird hardware that's like really old, or you need an embedded system, something like that, then TinyCore is the way to go. And by old hardware, I'm not talking about like hardware that's like 15 years old. I'm talking about hardware that's like 25 years old. Still, they're both very niche, but I'm still both going to give them B tiers because they do exactly what they accomplish. Next up, we have Artix and Debian. This is Arch and Debian respectively, but just without systemd. That's pretty much the only difference worth noting. That is a huge change, but it's also something that for a lot of people isn't that necessary. This is something you would only want if you're like a diehard Linux user and you know exactly why you don't want systemd. But if, like I said, if you don't know what systemd is, these are not the distros for you, but they still both do what they aim to achieve. Artix, you get the Arch platform without systemd. Debian, you get the Debian system without systemd. And so I'm going to give these two distributions B tier. Next up, we have Deepin. This is known for being one of the most beautiful desktops there is, and it is pretty consumer friendly. They do have an immutable system now, which means it won't break. And they have their own desktop environment that, like I said, is known for being like the most beautiful desktop experience on Linux. But the problem with it is they have sort of their own suite of applications that fits within the Deepin desktop. But outside of all the official like pre-installed applications, there's barely any community supported applications, and it kind of starts falling apart looks wise as soon as you open any other application. On top of that, it is made by a Chinese company, which I'm not one of those people who won't use anything made by a Chinese company, but it's just very tailored towards the Chinese market, and there's going to be parts of the operating system that are just in Chinese. You're going to be noticing things that are clearly aimed at the Chinese market within the operating system. I think if you are in China and you just want something that works, it could be a very good experience like an A tier or even an S tier. But for a Western type audience, I think it's going to have to be C tier because, like I said, distro just falls apart as soon as you try to open any app that isn't made by the Deepin team. And sometimes the desktop can get very annoying. Oh, another thing, they're making their own alternative to flat package snap now that works worse than both of them. Okay, now that I'm remembering their new package system, I'm gonna have to go D tier. Just use a other distro that ships their desktop environment. Next up, we have the Mandriva family of distributions. So we have PC, Linux OS, Manjaro, and Open Mandriva. So back in the day, there used to be these distros called Mandrake, which eventually evolved into Mandriva, and then that got discontinued, and these are kind of the remnants of it. So Magia, don't think I'm pronouncing that right, kind of just carries on the legacy of what Mandriva used to be, whereas Open Mandriva carries that legacy but then is a little bit more experimental and more willing to ship things. And then PC Linux OS is a rolling release distro that is known to be very stable. Like, I've seen people in the community talk about having PC Linux OS installations since 2010 that haven't broken. I do think if you're running Open Mandriva or Magia, it's kind of out of nostalgia for the old Mandrake and Mandriva days. They do have the Mandriva control panel, which is kind of like what Yast is on openSUSE, but I think Yast is better executed and does more things. So for that reason, I'm going to give Open Mandriva and Magia B tiers. However, I'm going to give PC Linux OS A tier just because of how stable it is as a rolling release distribution. Next up, we have KDE Neon. This is supposed to be sort of a testing ground for KDE. I've always had issues with KDE Neon. I've never successfully ran a KDE Neon installation for more than like a week without having too many problems to leave. It's supposed to be like a testing branch, and it does some weird things like it's Ubuntu based but then ships newer KDE dependencies, and that's kind of why it has the tendency to break sometimes. And so I think if you aren't a KDE developer, you should be using any other distro that ships KDE, and so I'm gonna have to give Neon a D tier. Next up, we have KaOS or KaOS. This for the longest time was supposed to be the KDE first Linux distro where it ships Pacman as the package manager but has its own repo full of just bleeding edge Qt and KDE stuff. However, it seems like this project has just completely lost direction. So if we go to their website, it still says it's focused on Qt and KDE on the homepage and advertises KDE all over the website. However, just recently they ditched KDE and they're now shipping a desktop called Noctulia, I think is what it's called, which uses the Neri window manager. And it's essentially a shell on top of Neri. So now it's a lot more of an advanced type experience because you can't just use KDE like you could KDE. Additionally, I actually wanted to make a video on this change, but I couldn't get it to install, and two different virtualization softwares or bare metal. I just couldn't get it installed no matter what I did. Not because the installation was breaking, but because the desktop just wouldn't boot no matter what I did. So I'm gonna give this a D tier. Next up, we have Bodhi Linux. So this used to be sort of the de facto distribution for the Enlightenment desktop environment, but then they moved on to forking Enlightenment and now they ship Moksha. This is going to be a very lightweight and sort of traditional Linux experience, and it's kind of inspired by like skeuomorphic design, gives it an interesting look. It's really the only desktop I know that still looks like that in 2026, and you get a pretty rock solid Ubuntu base. However, development has stalled. The latest version of Bodhi Linux is still based on Ubuntu 22.04, and for reference, when I'm making this video, 26.04 comes out next month, and that's 2 LTS releases ahead. So for that reason, I'm gonna have to give Bodhi Linux a C tier. Next up, we have Alpine Linux. So the whole point of Alpine Linux is it's supposed to be a very light distribution and a very secure Linux distribution. So it actually ditches GNU core utils, which is your standard stuff like CD, ls, like tools like that you use on a Linux system. They ditch it for BusyBox. They also don't ship systemd. Think they ship OpenRC? Yep, they do. But the point is, you're getting basically a very fast, light, and stable platform. This is actually one of the only distros where I think not using systemd makes a lot of sense for the usage of this distro, because Alpine Linux, because it's such a light distribution, I think you can install it in, here it is, 8 megabytes for a container, and a minimal installs 130 megabytes. This is one of the best distributions for a lightweight container and things like that, and it's just a very good package platform to build on top of for things like embedded devices. So I'm giving Alpine an S tier. Next up, we have SteamOS. Now, SteamOS does only work on Valve hardware like the Steam Deck and the Steam Machine, as well as a couple other third-party hardware manufacturers that partnered with them. So this isn't something you're going to install on just any system. For that, go and install Bazzite, which is a very similar experience. But SteamOS is based on Arch, so you're getting very new packages with the latest drivers and optimizations, but they have a immutable setup, which means it's actually not going to break, and you're not going to have to do anything to maintain it like you would with any other Arch distribution. It kind of just works as a console OS. It's just as stable as like an Xbox or PlayStation OS. You can simply install your games and just run them, even Windows games. I guess that is a Steam feature. You can do that on any distro, but that's not the point. Just a very good console type OS experience if you run it on the right hardware. And for that reason, I have to give it S tier. Now, our final operating system here is going to be Chrome OS. So this is basically you're booting the Chrome web browser as your operating system. You can run Android apps too if you're running it on compatible hardware with Android, and you can run Linux apps too through containers. This is going to be very, very stable and mom friendly, but you're also stuck to using Chrome and Google services throughout the entire operating system, and it's going to be collecting a lot of data. And so if you're trying to get out of the enshittification of Windows or Mac OS, Chrome OS is not going to be the option for you. But they do have Chrome OS Flex, which you can install on other hardware, and it's just a stable, reliable, easy to use Chrome OS experience. And so that could be great if you need to breathe life into a computer that doesn't support Windows 11 and you need to give it to someone. I've taken a lot of inspiration of how Chrome OS handles web apps for my project SteamOS. And so with all that in consideration, I'm going to end up giving Chrome OS a B tier. So which distribution are you going to be using or are running right now, and why is that? If I missed any distributions, I'm sorry. I've just really been trying to get through the notable ones because we'd be here all day if I did every single one of the 500 options available. But other than that, I hope this video was helpful for you to make a choice on what distribution you want to use. That said, thank you for watching this video. I talked about immutable distributions a few times, like Fedora Silverblue and the Universal Brew project, as well as NixOS. And if you're more interested in that type of distribution, go and watch this video right here. Other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video.